Welcome to this recording of Intercultural Leadership and the Role of the IDI. My name is Kathy Berglund and I serve as the Chief Learning Officer of Impact Lives. In our transformational leadership work at Impact Lives, we follow a 4I model. We believe in an inside-out approach to leadership, starting with identity, or answering the question, who am I? When it comes to intercultural competence, we believe it is vital to first understand our own worldviews and how our brains are interpreting cultural similarities and differences before we can best work and lead in intercultural settings. Secondly, we need to focus on integration, or understanding those around us. While your IDI results are confidential, and it will be up to you if you choose to share them with others, we believe it is helpful if teams do share the results with each other. Knowing whether a teammate is more in the monocultural or intercultural mindset could make a difference in deciding who is best suited to handle a particular conversation or issue. Intrinsic motivation answers the question, why do I do what I do? And this course will cover subjects related to our mental models, assumptions, and biases. We really need to learn to depersonalize the behaviors of others and understand their preferences and cultural dimensions. Finally, armed with information about ourselves, those around us, and why we do what we do, we can be in the best position to lead effectively. The goal is really to lead from a multicultural mindset, so that we can influence and create equitable and inclusive environments. On page 3 of your handout, you will see these 3 reflection questions. I encourage you to pause this webinar at this point and take 5 to 10 minutes to answer these questions for yourself. It is important to really understand why leading with intercultural competence matters. It is the right work to do. It is wonderful to build and have vibrant relationships with those who are different from you. But it is also hard and messy work. I know for myself, I need to reground myself as to the why of this work. And this may be frustrating for you to hear, but we can never truly become competent in this arena. There are so many different cultures and nuances to learn. And the topics of culture continue to change. I think about things we're talking about now that we were not talking about 5 years ago. What will we be talking about 5 years from now that isn't even on our radar screen? We can all get better at different elements of culture, but we'll never fully arrive. So here's a 3-part framework that I have tried to use. Start with humility. Understand that you don't know everything and that your way may not be the best. Secondly, adopt a genuine curiosity about others. Show a sincere desire to learn. And don't get into relationships or ask questions if you have any sort of agenda. Finally, approach all relationships with a desire to serve another. I really believe that if you follow that 3-part framework, you may still make mistakes and you will never be fully competent, but that others will have grace and understanding for your journey. In this next section, let's take a look at the changing demographics. This will be information from around the Twin Cities, in the state of Minnesota, and the nation as a whole. So here's a look at the immigrant population within the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. Our diversity in the Twin Cities is changing rapidly. Now, this is a very interesting and important slide. While not everybody cares for the term tipping point, it is helpful to see in the state of Minnesota when there will be more people of color than white. The state has already tipped for children 10 and under. Starting in 2016, there were more children of color than white children. And you can see that that will happen in 2026 for people 40 and under, in 2032 for people 60 and under. Obviously, when numbers are all averaged together, it doesn't take into account portions of the state that have already tipped and other portions of the state that may not tip for several years after the date noted on this chart. We believe that improving our intercultural competence is simply the right work to do, no matter what the statistics say. But if you are needing to convince another as to the significance of this work, the information on this slide may be helpful. This is a similar chart, but it is updated to reflect 2018 data, and it is descriptive of the whole United States. So while the numbers don't line up perfectly to the last chart, the concept is certainly the same. So as our Twin Cities, our state, and our nation continue to become more diverse, which of the populations are growing? This slide shows you some numbers related to the 3 different ethnic groups and 1 sexual orientation group. This is a busy slide, but it provides some helpful information. For example, you can see that the Hispanic population is growing the most by percentage. But take a look at the 2+ race percentages, that blue bar, and how they are growing over time. As we become more interculturally competent, it isn't just 1 or 2 ethnic groups to take into account, but we need to keep in mind that more and more people will represent more than 1 ethnic group or more than 1 culture. To add to the complexity of this work, as you get to know the cultural norms of a first-generation immigrant, those same norms may not be the same for a 2nd or 3rd-generation immigrant. This chart or table again is focused on the Twin Cities, but it shows a difficult set of statistics when it comes to disparities. We may be diverse, but we continue to have huge disparities between white and people of color. Those number ones on the right-hand side indicate that our disparities on those 3 elements or dimensions are the highest compared to 24 other large metro areas. And you may have seen this study that came out in August of 2017. When comparing white and Black people, the state of Minnesota is the 2nd worst in the nation for income, home ownership, and incarceration. Wisconsin's disparities are the worst in the nation. There certainly is a lot more work that needs to be done. So as we look to the future, what do we need to keep in mind? Dr. Ramon Pastrano, the CEO and founder of Impact Lives, likes to point out that we cannot solve our 21st century problems with 20th century mindsets. And in the same way, we cannot solve problems in a multicultural world with a monocultural mindset. We like to use iceberg analogies for several of our teaching points. If you look at the top of the iceberg, what appears to all of us is visible behavior. When it comes to this work, people from organizations often ask us, just tell me what to do and what to say. Is the right term American Indian or Native American, or is it Indigenous people? And when as a white female, when I meet a Somali man, do I shake his hand or don't I shake his hand? These are great questions, and I don't mean to dismiss the need for some guidelines in what to say and what to do. But if we simply focus on the do's and don'ts of our language and behavior without going deeper into our thoughts and beliefs, we won't truly be effective in our intercultural relationships. This work involves some deep and internal thought for both individuals and organizations. Start at the bottom of this visual and see how our feelings, attitudes, values, and beliefs drive our thoughts. Our thoughts create our systems, and the systems produce the behavior. You will see iceberg pictures later in this presentation. For now, simply recognize the power of what lies below the surface. This slide, you can see that intercultural competence is rated as the 3rd most important skill to have for success. Number 1 is business acumen. You need to know how the business or organization is run, and you need great technical skills. Number 2 is emotional intelligence. And once you get more into this work, you will see some direct connections between the concepts of emotional intelligence and cultural competence. But before we go further, let's take a look at a few important terms. As you see these terms on this slide, what do you think? Do you think intercultural intelligence and intercultural competence are the same, or are they different? Some people use them interchangeably, but they really are different from each other. You may have noticed that sometimes I refer to it as cultural intelligence or cultural competence. Other times I use intercultural. We believe that those two terms can be used more interchangeably. But there's a significant difference between intelligence and competence. Someone who is culturally intelligent may know a lot about certain culture. They can read up on the internet, they can take classes, they can find ways to know the facts about a certain culture. But that intelligence alone will likely not make a person competent. Cultural competence refers to being in relationships with those who are different from you, making mistakes, adjusting, and adapting to what you learn. I refer to it as diving into the deep end of the pool and taking the learning out of the classroom and putting it into practice in the context of intercultural relationships. And before we move to the next section, it's really good to be reminded that we go through these stages of competence. We start out being unconsciously incompetent, or we don't know what we don't know. Then, as we learn more, we go to conscious incompetence, then to conscious competence, and hopefully to unconscious competence. Some people move through these stages quickly, others more slowly. Now, as adults, we don't often put ourselves in situations where we know we will feel incompetent. But sometimes this work and bridging across cultures can be difficult, and you will feel incompetent at times. But stay with it. The work is worth it. Let's move on to learn more about how our worldviews and biases may affect our intercultural competence. It's so important to recognize that we can never truly be objective as we take in information. Boy, I'd sure like to believe that when I encounter people, situations, and events, that I can be completely objective. But my life experiences, blind spots, and biases all affect what I see and hear. And we really like that quote by a 9 Nin. We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. And it is human nature to create what we expect and to see what we expect to see. So just what is a worldview? This quote by Paul Hebert has some great explanations, and I really appreciate the metaphor of glasses. A worldview is the glasses through which we all look. We often don't know what constitutes our worldview until we travel or encounter other worldviews or spend time in reflection. So how are they formed? There are 4 primary determinants of your current worldview: your family of origin, the educational system growing up, your faith institution, if that was a part of your life growing up, and the media or social media. Here's one version of a diversity wheel, and it shows that our attitudes and beliefs about all of the items in those circles are really formed and informed by our worldviews. And the closer to the center of the circle, the harder it is to change those thoughts and those beliefs. Keep in mind that all of the items on this slide act as filters as we take in information and we communicate with others. As we grow in intercultural competence, we sometimes find that the worldviews we have been taught growing up are not the same ones we want to have as adults. And sometimes when we get to know other people, we find that our worldviews don't mesh. Or you may believe that someone else's current worldview is just wrong. Before you embark on the hard and deep work of changing your worldviews, keep in mind that they provide some very important functions. On this slide, you see that it helps explain your world. It validates your norms. It gives you emotional security. It helps organize your world and helps you adapt. And so many people do find that they want to change their worldview, but it can be difficult work. And if you encounter others who have different worldviews or worldviews with which you don't agree, just remember that their worldviews are also performing very important functions for them. So here's another nice iceberg graphic that shows how deeply held our worldviews are and how those worldviews impact beliefs, which impact values, which then impact our behavior. We may react to someone else's behavior and become frustrated at what they do, but fail to recognize that those behaviors are usually coming from a worldview that is not immediately visible to all of us. At this point, we're going to watch a 4-minute video. This comes from Google. It's called Making the Unconscious Conscious, and it just helps illustrate the power of these different worldviews and assumptions.
What would the world look like if everybody were aware of the stereotypes that they have and the biases that they have? When we talk about unconscious bias, we're basically saying our worldview can actually exert an influence beyond our conscious awareness, and it creates ambiguity.
You go to an engineer who's built something extremely innovative, and you say, who do you think your user is? This is where I have the most fun. My name is TV Raman, and I led our work on Android accessibility for 3 years. Write down everything that you think you know about your user with respect to abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. Almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable, because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts that our brain has created so that we can deal with the information that we process every single day.
Right when we see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are implicitly, automatically making judgments about how warm and competent that person or thing is.
All humans need to make decisions, and so we fill in the blanks because our brains are wired to do that, and we fill in with things we don't know with, past experience. Oh, you pattern map to someone I think I should hire, so I'm going to hire you versus this person because they didn't map, because I can't fill in the blank because they don't look like me, or they're not from my same background, and so I can't see how they're going to make the jump.
Every single person is great at things that you may not expect them to be, but it's really hard for us to see that when we're so powerfully guided by the things we expect to be true in the world.
I grew up surrounded with this conversation about what you can't do and what you won't be able to do. My name's Enrico, and I'm an autistic software engineer. The first time I go through the performance review process, I was asked for 5 strengths. It was the first time that I had ever been prompted to think in that way about myself, and it was really a life-changing moment for me.
When we are working in our day-to-day jobs, we are still making judgments about the people around us, about the resumes we see, about the employees that we're trying to decide, whether to put them on teams or not.
People are very wedded to the idea that they can perceive something objectively, and statistically they're wrong, but it's hard. You become attached to this idea that you can assess something by looking at it.
These subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, who we're putting in leadership positions. We have the responsibility to understand the assumptions that we make and understand the errors that we make.
But it's not just for the collective good. If you take the time to understand more about this, there are things that you can implement for yourself that'll help you develop as a leader and to do your job even better.
It made me realize how often I have a very strong belief that is simply incorrect. When I look at one of these evaluation situations, the first question is, how can I eliminate the sources of potential bias and leave just the data so we can actually make better decisions?
If you're not conscious of the biases that you have, you're just not contributing at the level that you could, and you're not innovating at the level you could. And so your products won't be as good. Your results won't be as good.
When you think outside the box with respect to the assumptions you made about how somebody would use this wonderful thing you built, and when you sort of broaden that perspective as to who you change the world for, you build something even bigger.
What are your thoughts about that video? Can you think about how some aspects of that might relate to you and your organization? The part where she talks about people who do or don't pattern map after someone who has been successful in a job, that always catches my attention. I sure know my biases and mental models kick in when I'm working with some new aspect of culture or difference. And when I see this visual, I think about the man in the video who talked about how often he has felt very strongly about something and it has turned out to be wrong. Now, in this cartoon, one isn't necessarily right or wrong, it is just a different perspective. But how often have you and I argued with someone else about whether that is really a 6 or a 9? Can two people look at the very same object, yet see it very differently from each other, and both be right? Before we talk more specifically about the Intercultural Development Inventory, as you continue on your own diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's really important to think through this question. Are these 3 terms different from each other, or are they all essentially the same? Here are some general definitions of each term. Now, most practitioners see these terms as being very different from each other, even though some people and organizations tend to use them interchangeably. Diversity is the who, or is about differences that make a difference. Now, in many of our settings, it's not that hard to achieve diversity. We often have differences in gender, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, or abilities, disabilities in our workplaces, neighborhoods, social settings, or schools. Now, inclusion is when we really honor, value, and leverage these differences for the good of the organization or the group. Some organizations are really pretty good at getting diversity in the front door, but without a culture of inclusion, those who are different quickly realize that their differences are not really welcomed here and they leave. Equity is about identifying and removing system barriers to help people achieve what they want to achieve. And we see that intercultural competence is the how and can help us achieve all of these terms. Now, this is a great picture of equity. On the surface, this seems to be a fair and equal task. They're both starting from the same point, and they both have the same finish line. But really understanding equity is about seeing the barriers that the woman has compared to the man. And here's another picture of equity, or more truthfully, inequity. It really seems to be a fair test without recognizing that some have built-in advantages and disadvantages to completing this exam. Let's move on to learn more about the IDI instrument and how it relates to intercultural competence. This slide shows that if we want to achieve diversity through the hiring process, it is important to have our hiring managers or team have an orientation on the intercultural end of the continuum. Looking at the words along the bottom, polarization and minimization represent more of the monocultural orientations, while acceptance is on the intercultural end of the continuum. I will explain more about these terms and the continuum in a future slide. And as we seek to have more multicultural teams, this infographic shows that multicultural teams actually have lower performance than homogeneous or monocultural teams when the leaders ignore and suppress those cultural differences. I just find this very interesting. This is a key slide when it comes to really understanding what is intercultural competence. We need to have all 3 of these elements. We need to start first with really understanding our own self, our culture, our worldview, how we see the world. Then we can learn all about differences and varied cultures. That second step is really a great explanation of cultural intelligence. And right now, our world makes it pretty easy to learn about or become smart about other cultures. But to truly leap from cultural intelligence to cultural competence, we have to do the last element. We have to be in intercultural relationships. We need to modify our behavior, learn, make mistakes, practice, and grow our skills. And the IDI helps us most with the first element, in that it helps us to know how our unconscious brains are dealing with cultural differences and similarities. When we talk about culture, keep in mind these two levels, objective and subjective. Too many people just stop at the objective aspects of culture, and they think they're really culturally competent when they know a certain country's preferred foods or customs or music. Yes, these are important markers of culture, but what is far more interesting and helpful when it comes to this work is what is below the water in this iceberg. What are the values, beliefs, and expectations of that culture? When it comes to understanding that I am from more of an individualistic culture and I work with somebody from a collectivistic culture, what does that mean? And how will I be most effective in that relationship? What difference will it make if someone from a high power distance and a low power distance are working together? Those types of cultural differences are often not very observable, but are far more important. When we see and behave from the monocultural side of the continuum and focus only on differences, we get fragmentation. But if we close the focus on difference eye and only have the focus on commonality eye open, we get conformity. Neither of those, fragmentation nor conformity, is going to be ideal in our relationships. Instead, we want to have both eyes open. We want to hold the cultural commonalities and differences together. When we do this, rather than having fragmentation and conformity, we get focus and we get innovation. This here is a great list that shows several different attributes we all need to have to do this work well. It's important to know, have a tolerance for ambiguity, to be flexible, to be adaptable, to be sensitive, to be creative. We've talked about humility earlier in this session, and finally to have grace, to be able to forgive ourselves and to others as we do this work. In this next section, we will actually walk through the model on which the inventory is based and learn about the various orientations. This is a very important list as we get into the details of the IDI. This model is holistic. It is developmental. With the different orientations, our brain needs to work through each one at a time. So if your current developmental orientation is polarization, the next step is minimization. It's not to pop you all the way up to adaptation. This instrument doesn't tell us how smart you are, how many diverse friends you have, how nice you are, or how well traveled you are. It is simply a measurement of how your brain is processing or what it is doing with cultural differences and similarities. The developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, or DMIS, was developed by Dr. Milton Bennett, and it is a continuum with several experiences ranging from the ethnocentric to the ethno-relative. Here's that continuum as developed by Bennett. Then Dr. Mitch Hammer created the IDI instrument as a way for us to all know where we fall on the different parts of this continuum. The left side of the continuum is the monocultural or ethnocentric mindset. The right side is the intercultural or ethno-relative mindset. How our brains work through this is somewhat fluid. You can be in one developmental orientation when you take this inventory the first time. You can work on and practice your strategies and then find yourself in a different orientation when you take it again. You are never stuck in just one orientation for your life. We will go into more depth about each of these orientations in the slides that follow. But if you get lost in all these details, keep in mind the phrases in the green boxes. The denial orientation misses differences. Polarization judges differences. Minimization de-emphasizes differences. Acceptance comprehends the differences. And finally, adaptation bridges the differences. We'll talk later about cultural disengagement, but note that this is not a measure of intercultural competence. It is really a standalone measure. I will now explain each of the orientations in more detail. If you have your handout available, you can follow along starting on page 9. We have 1 page per orientation in that handout, and that information is really a helpful reference, as I will be going through the orientations fairly quickly. In the denial of cultural difference orientation, a person just doesn't see cultural differences at all. Or they may notice that someone has a different skin color or that English is not their first language, but they won't see any of those subjective elements of culture or what is below the iceberg. They won't see or recognize differences in values, attitudes, and beliefs. And if those differences are pointed out, they may just have a sense of apathy or not see any relevance in the conversation. You can see the strength of this orientation as well as the general developmental strategy to move through the denial of cultural differences. When we move to the polarization orientation, now the person does see differences, and there is some sort of evaluation or judgment attached to the difference. This orientation has 2 different paths, defense and reversal. In defense, the person is overly generous of their own culture and overly critical of the other culture. The person may have very strong positive attitudes about their gender or age, sexual orientation, or faith system, and have very strong negative beliefs about the other. They may think that whoever they are is good, better, or preferable, while the other is bad, worse, or not preferred. In reversal, it's just the opposite. Now, a person in this orientation is overly generous of the other and critical of the me. An example of this may be when a student spends a semester abroad and, upon coming home, views the other culture where they have just been living as all wonderful and so much better than home. The general developmental strategy here is to reduce that focus on differences and to begin to see the commonalities. Minimization of cultural difference is the most common developmental orientation. 66% of people who take the IDI are in the minimization orientation, and this is true for both the dominant and the non-dominant cultures. In minimization, it is as though the person closes that eye that has been focusing only on differences and now only has the eye open that focuses on similarities or commonalities. In minimization, a person emphasizes common values and experiences. They may say things like, all lives matter. And it works to point out that we are really more the same than we are different. Once we get to acceptance, we have moved to the intercultural or ethno-relative side of the continuum. Now in acceptance, the person has both eyes open. They are comfortable recognizing both differences and similarities. The hallmark of this orientation is curiosity and a desire to learn. They ask a lot of questions. They're willing to admit they don't know about the other cultures. They spend a lot of time reading, observing, and generally going to school about other cultures. The final stage is adaptation, and in this orientation, it is not enough to simply learn about other cultures. Now this person has a lot of intercultural relationships and practices what they have learned. In the developmental orientation of adaptation, the person is able to go in and out of different cultures. They can bridge the cultures, all without assimilating and giving up their core values and beliefs. That's a very key point. Many people feel that in true intercultural relationships, they have to tolerate or agree with everything, and that is just not the case. The goal is to know your own culture and worldview, get up from your side of the table, and see things from the other person's cultural lens and worldview. To learn about, understand, and respect that other culture, but still maintain your own values, attitudes, and beliefs. You certainly may adapt your behavior while in that cultural context, but you do so out of respect and a deep understanding about what is important in that culture. Now let's walk through the group results for the YMCA. If you have your IDI profile available, you might want to reference your own personal results as you see the group results on the various scales. So the first scale that the IDI measures is perceived orientation. Sometimes we refer to it as the PO. This measure is how you rate your skills and abilities in terms of intercultural competence. This is how your conscious brain is responding to cultural similarities and differences. This is where you hope to be, your aspirations in this subject. It can also be described as how you project yourself into a future situation. For example, if later today or tomorrow, you know that you are going into a situation with a lot of cultural dynamics, you start to think through how you're going to respond and talk and act. That is like your perceived orientation. And in this case with the YMCA, the group results show the perceived orientation to be in acceptance. Remember that acceptance is when you have moved to the early stages of the intercultural end of the continuum. You see both similarities and differences in culture, and you have a strong desire to learn about the other culture. Now, the second scale is developmental orientation, or DO. While your conscious brain activity is showing up in the perceived orientation scale, the unconscious brain activity is measured here in the developmental orientation. This is the real you as we see you responding to cultural similarities and differences. The group results place you in the minimization orientation. And you might remember that minimization is where most people who take the IDI measure for the developmental orientation. This is an overemphasis on commonality, shared values and beliefs, and similarities. Each of the YMCA groups that we have measured over the last couple of years have had a PO of acceptance and a DO of minimization. So as you can see, the PO is higher than the DO, which creates a gap. You can see that the group results show a gap of 24.38. And the phrase here on this slide and in your profile indicate that a gap of 7 or more is meaningful. You can also interpret that as statistically significant. If your gap is 7 points or higher, you overestimate your skills and abilities for intercultural competence to a statistically significant degree. If it's less than 7, your gap is not statistically significant. And don't be worried if your gap is much higher than this. This slide shows the range of developmental orientations for the YMCA group. Here you can see the pronounced number or percentage of people either at the cusp of minimization or in minimization. Now let me explain a little bit about trailing orientations. If your report has these circles with numbers and descriptions, then you have at least one trailing orientation. Now, not everybody has a trailing orientation, so you might be looking through your report and not be seeing any of these circles. Here's how to understand trailing orientations, and I'll just use these group results as though they were a person. Even though the current developmental orientation is in minimization, there are particular times or certain topics or specific situations where your brain will get pulled back to a previous orientation. Sometimes a person trails back just one orientation, sometimes two orientations. And anyone may have a trailing orientation, even those who have a developmental orientation in acceptance or even adaptation. In the case of the YMCA, as a group, you get pulled back just one orientation from minimization to polarization, and it shows up in the form of reversal. Remember that polarization reversal is when you judge your culture more critically and evaluate the other very generously. Now notice the number of 3.87. If I were to assign a label or a word to that, I would call it a very slight tendency to trail back to reversal. If the score had been 4.001 or higher, this wouldn't even show up. The closer to 4, the milder the tendency to trail back. The closer to 1, the stronger the tendency to move back an orientation or 2. So in this case, every once in a while, you will move back to reversal, but not very often. Sometimes we get asked, well, when do I do this? As your qualified administrators, we have exactly the same reports as you do, and we don't know the specific situations when this might happen. During your one-to-one conversation about your IDI results, your qualified administrator will review this with you and might help you think through when this might be occurring. The next scale is called the leading orientation, and it's fairly obvious, as it is simply the next orientation toward the intercultural end of the continuum. In your case, the leading orientation is acceptance. The last scale that the IDI measures is cultural disengagement or resolution. If you are not resolved, which means having a score less than 4, you may feel that you're an outsider in your own group. You might have difficulty participating in important symbols, events, and activities shared in your community. It might be related to experiences of being rejected in your own group, or you might feel that you are between 2 or more different cultural communities. This scale is measuring a few different things. First, if I gave you a list of facts about your cultural identities, you would not be confused. You wouldn't really wonder about your gender, abilities, faith, ethnicity, etc. You would also have a fairly good sense of how those cultural identities affect how you see the world. It also may show how well you know your own feelings, attitudes, and beliefs, and where they come from. I think of it as being grounded, for better or worse, as to who you are and what matters to you. While cultural engagement or disengagement isn't a measure of intercultural competence, it can be helpful and help you be more effective in navigating intercultural relationships. So your group results show a 4.12 on this dimension, which means the group as a whole is resolved. That pie chart to the right indicates that 68% of you are culturally resolved, while 32% of you are not. During your IDI 101 conversation, the qualified administrator will be able to explain more about this and will show you strategies in your intercultural development plan or IDP to work on this element. So that's it for a walkthrough of the different scales that the IDI measures and your YMCA group results. So as we finish up, as the group developmental orientation is in minimization, let's take a little deeper look at what that means. You will find some of these notes in your handout as well. So here's the strength in minimization. You recognize the humanity of all people and try to behave in tolerant ways. Now, this is an interesting quote by C.S. Lewis. Take just a moment, read through this quote, and reflect on what it means to you. When an organization is functioning primarily in the orientation of minimization, here are some descriptions and characteristics. Which ones stand out to you? Which ones, if true, might create additional barriers in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the YMCA? Here are a few implications that may arise as the result of the minimization developmental orientation. And here are 6 more implications that are worth considering. Finally, as we look at moving from minimization, it's really important to recognize that this is an adaptive, not a technical challenge. Adaptive challenges are much harder to influence. It is not as easy as putting in a new form or simply having everyone participate in a training session. As we wrap up this section of the Intercultural Leadership Training, take a look at the case studies on the final page of your handout. In our group sessions, everyone participates in an interactive exercise where we review the definitions of the different orientations of denial of cultural differences, polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. We then look at one or both of those case studies through the lenses of each of those orientations. I encourage you to take some time to do your own reflection on how people with orientations at the different parts of the continuum might respond to or react to those situations. Thank you very much for your time to participate in this recorded session. Look for more communication very soon about setting up your IDI one-on-one conversation with one of our qualified administrators.